Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me. This is the final episode in my Booze Riot series. We started with champagne in France, whiskey in the U.S., and then we cruised on to rum on 2 different continents, and we're going to end this series with the Lager Beer Riot in Chicago and the Eggnog Riot at West Point in New York. Shout out to some of my friends who went to West Point and didn't realize this was buried deep in your school's legendary history. First up, do not, and I repeat, do not get between Chicago and its booze. So implies the Chicago History Museum's entry on this event. Like the Maine Law Riot or the Portland Rum Riot, the whole thing started when another teetotaling mayor tried to keep their fair citizens from their drink. And like the Portland Rum Riot, the law on deck was perceived to be taking aim at a specific population of people. In Portland, it was the Irish. In Chicago, it was the Irish and the Germans. It's funny now to even think that you're going to keep Germans from their beer, but go on with your bad self, Mayor Levi Boone. Yes, Mayor Levi Boone. Back in 1855, when this riot ensued, the locals were known for working 6 days a week. It goes without saying that on the day of rest, perhaps fair citizens would like to kick back with a brewski. But no, the mayor, Levi Boone, tried to enforce, or should I say, reinforce an ordinance that keeps pubs closed on the only day of the week the workers have off, Sunday. For the most part, the pub owners kind of ignored this silly mandate, and if they weren't selling beer on Sunday, they were missing out on sales. Hello, capitalism. But this disdain for the ordinance also caused no fewer than 60 arrests and 1 death on the 21st of April, 1855. But let's just back up the riot truck here, because it was the March 6th elections and politics, I know. But that's what started this ugliness. The only people that cared about local and city elections in the 1840s and 1850s were actually real estate owners. Otherwise, regular voters didn't bother turning out for such things. Let this be a lesson to all of you out there who do not pay attention to local elections, by the way. In an article by Robin Einhorn for the Encyclopedia of Chicago, we learned that this is precisely how the, and I'm going to quote here, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic nativists, and temperance advocates, end quote. This is how they snuck in under the radar with their so-called law and order and moral reform agenda. Not only did extremists have a very thin base of public support, their new mayor began his assault on everything from liquor licenses to immigrants. Here are some examples. Old Levi Boone boosted the police force to 3 times its former size, and he forbade them from hiring any immigrants. As for the liquor licenses, the fees were jacked up by the city council, and instead of holding a liquor license for a year, you now had to renew it every 3 months. I'm sure a lot of my retail shop owners out there are cringing at that. And since no one was paying attention to the closed on Sunday ordinance, the now newly uniformed police were directed to properly enforce the ordinance. That's right, police didn't wear uniforms in Chicago before this time. This resulted in some local Germans getting together to raise funds to defend those who were rolled up for not complying with the closed on Sunday rule. And think about it, this was before GoFundMe, this was before the internet. So they just did some local fundraising, but in the meantime, the courts were packed with prosecutions. When a test case by attorneys was scheduled for the 21st day in April, you can imagine what ensued. Once again, as in Portland, a crowd of concerned citizens gathered outside the courthouse, but this time they were showing up to support the defendants. Once again, also, the mayor tried to get the crowd to disperse, and 9 more folks were arrested. And in what could have been one of America's first bridge gates, Boone raised the Clark Street drawbridge to keep a bunch of armed Germans from Chicago's north side from descending upon the ruckus. Once Boone was able to gather a couple hundred police on his side, he lowered the bridge. Then the shooting started as the North Side constituency rolled across the bridge. After that, the militia was called in. This riot would be the event that would forever mobilize the city's voters. The next year would see a huge show of Irish and German voters showing up to vote out these nativist extremists, and they would restore the original $50 liquor license fees. I think we can all learn a little something about not ignoring the small elections in your community here. And P.S., don't mess with our booze. Speaking of fighting for your right to party, we head to the East Coast and to one of our esteemed military academies. Let's see what our trusty West Point cadets were up to only 30 years prior. It was holiday time, December 1826. A tradition among cadets was to enjoy a little homemade eggnog and the like, as life at West Point, which some of my listeners actually know firsthand, can be quite intense. For the most part, superintendents in the past really hadn't bothered with the cadets, indulging a little Christmas cheer during the holidays. That was until Colonel Sylvanus Thayer rolled up on the scene. He was very serious about enforcing the no alcohol rules. Let's stop and think about that, because you may remember in the Rum, Riots, and Rebellions episode, I said that Americans were swilling about 7.1 gallons of pure alcohol each year. And just like the New South Wales Corps, the military, they had their own reputation, was nicknamed the Rum Corps. Well, the West Point cadets had their own little reputation at the time. They had a reputation for being drunks, but they were still allowed to have a little tipple during holiday celebrations like Christmas and 4th of July holidays. And it was on Christmas Eve, according to a 2018 Big Think article by Matt Davis, these intrepid cadets crossed the Hudson River to obtain whiskey from various taverns. The three wise men, they were not. And during this mission, they got into some minor altercations over liquor prices and then bribed a security guard on the way back with a whopping 35 cents to pretend he saw nothing. And all I can think of when I read this was the Colonel Schultz defense. If you've ever watched Hogan Heroes, and I know I'm dating myself, I see nothing. I see nothing. Another anecdote I must insert here, besides the boomer-era Hogan's Heroes reference, I've been to West Point, and I've stayed at Thayer House, which is a little hotel. It's beautiful, actually, right inside the gate. Now I know for whom it is named, and this eggnog incident will be fresh in my mind when I head back there in October. But I have to say, there's really nothing around that base that one could walk to, at least. Like most military bases, you can't just walk outside the gate and find great restaurants. We stepped out to find some dinner, and let's just say the restaurant situation was a little bleak. So I can imagine what things were like 2 centuries ago, that they actually had to cross the river to get some decent booze or a decent price on booze. However, just because I couldn't find a decent restaurant in December of 2017 doesn't mean I rioted. But back to 1826. In an article by Carol Funk on the U.S. Army's official website, we learn, while Colonel Thayer's insistence that the rule against buying or drinking alcohol, it worked for some students. Others saw this as a challenge. And why not, some cadets thought, why not make this, and I quote, the best holiday celebration West Point has ever seen, end quote. Their mission, and they chose to accept it, was to outfox Thayer. Thus, that Christmas Eve, as the party got rocking, it was the sound of singing that woke up Captain Alan Hitchcock at 4 a.m. After insisting the drunk cadets get in their bunks, he realized more ruckus was coming from next door. According to the Big Think and How Stuff Works ridiculous history articles, both linked in the show notes, the rowdy next-door neighbors caught wind that Hitchcock was inbound, so these geniuses thought they would hide. 2 of them thought, I guess, nobody was going to see them under their blankets, so they're hiding under blankets, and a third numbskull puts a hat over his face, like, oh, I can't see you, you can't see me. Yet Sherlock, nothing to see here. The student refused to remove the hat in front of his face to reveal who he was. And I just had to crack up at this. So as Hitchcock continues his not-so-fun party crashing of more rowdy, drunken escapades, cadets could be heard shouting, and this is a quote, "Get your dirks and bayonets and pistols if you have them. Before this night is over, Hitchcock will be dead." End quote. Captain Hitchcock would no sooner break up one group of revelers before he'd hear another bunch, and the noise and activities became more violent as he went. One cadet actually tried to shoot Hitchcock with his pistol and was bumped by another cadet, thus hitting the door jamb instead. Down the hall, Lieutenant William Thornton was also trying to get the situation in control, but he was hit on the head with a big chunk of wood. And then another rabble-rouser thought he would fight Thornton off with a sword. One big miscommunication after another resulted in the artillerymen arriving on the scene, but not to party, as the cadets and artillerymen, they were not happy to see each other. Theirs was a long-standing rivalry that took the riding to the next level of destruction. 70 to 90 cadets or more, depending on your source, not only indulged in what some would say was a celebration turned riot. Windows and plates were broken, stairway banisters were ripped out, and the North Barracks was all but destroyed. Lots of shit was broken because of the fight. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. The day after Christmas, after a meeting between Thayer and his staff, several orders were issued initiating a chain of events that would open a court of inquiry, put 22 cadets on restrictions, and start investigative interviews. A month later, these orders resulted in 19 cadets being court-martialed along with one soldier. The hearings actually lasted until March 1827. Included in the defense of the 19 classmates were Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. You may have heard of them. It turns out Davis was also involved in the riots. After trying to warn some celebrants that Captain Hitchcock was inbound ASAPly and instructing his buddies to hide the hooch, Hitchcock was right behind him. So Davis was ordered off to bed, and because he obeyed, he was never charged, at least in this incident, which is odd because Thayer tried to make an example of him earlier because Davis already had earned the reputation to be the first cadet in 1826 to be arrested for drinking, and he had stumbled into a 60-foot ravine whilst tanked. But 11 of the defendants were eventually expelled from West Point. Only 5 of the remaining 8 stayed at the academy. All of this because a bunch of young punks with weapons couldn't handle their booze. So there you have it, the Eggnog Riot at West Point in 1826. I really like this story, and I love the sources I was able to find on it. There was a podcast to listen to at the bottom of the How Stuff Works Ridiculous History page. The podcast is called Stuff You Missed in History Class. It is fantastic. And I listened to this while driving yesterday after most of this podcast was already written, but the hosts are Tracy and Holly, and they are ladies that I most definitely want to drink with. They also give a little more history of eggnog and how whiskey ended up in the eggnog to begin with. I will tell you, I am not drinking eggnog right now. It is not my favorite holiday beverage. They also give a little bit more history on West Point if you're not familiar with its history as a military academy, and I know some of my listeners actually attended West Point. So if you haven't, I definitely recommend checking out the episode of Stuff You Missed in History Class that I've linked up at the end of this episode in the show notes. I'm adding Stuff You Missed in History Class to my already crammed podcast feed. I noticed there was an episode on the Rum Rebellion, and I cannot wait to dig into other episodes of this podcast. And I linked it up. It does deserve its own reference because I'm on this history kink right now. Right now, I'm binging books about Sisi, or Empress Elizabeth of Austria. I will be looking for an episode on her amongst their episodes. I hope they have one. And she will most certainly be the inspiration behind an upcoming Hungarian wine episode. I know that one's probably confusing you in your mind, but there is a connection. For now, I want to thank you for joining me for another round of rebellions and riots. This is the conclusion of our 3-part series on booze riots. Should I discover more, we might visit them in a future season. As always, I'm grateful to you for clicking play, for joining me for these crazy stories in the history of wine and spirits, as well as the privilege of a spot in your podcast feed every 2 weeks, however crammed it may be. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime, however, between sessions. You can find me on Twitter at WineGalUnboxed. You can email me at val@glassandsession.com. And on the Facebook, Pinterest, and Instaspaces, I'm Vino with Val. Glass and Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. Additional music this week, Pixabay's Ultra Metal by Loyalty Freak Music. Website is glassandsession.com/podcast.